For today's video, I'll be debunking some common myths about Walstad Method aquariums. I do think that content creators, myself included, share some of the responsibility for these because of how we title our content, but there's a lot of contributing factors. The footage you'll see in this video comes from a mix of my aquariums, some follow the Walstad method and others don't. So the first myth is that Walstad method tanks don't use filters, but this isn't entirely true. While it is possible to set up a Walstad method tank without the use of a filter, even Dianna Walstad herself uses filters in some of her tanks. If we look at her book, she provides clear examples of using her filters. On page 57, she mentions using both canister and hang-on-back filters in some of her tanks. But on page 199, she also explains that biological filters may not be necessary, while also confirming that she sometimes uses small, cheap, submerged filters in certain tanks. So, if you are new to planted tanks and want to try the Walstad method, I would highly recommend starting with some type of filter for your first setup. A basic hang-on-back or sponge filter is a cheap option and it provides several benefits such as water flow, mechanical filtration and a safety net for biological filtration. But if you are determined to go filterless, then I highly recommend the use of a cheap USB water pump. These create water flow, which helps to maintain safe and stable water parameters to move the toxic water around your tank to make sure it comes into contact with beneficial bacteria, archaea and plants to purify it. This next myth is that plants are the filters in Walstad method aquariums, and while this is partially true, there's a lot of misconceptions wrapped up in it. Plants do absorb a lot of harmful compounds like nitrogen and heavy metals from the water column, helping to purify the water and keep your fish safe. But the situation is a lot more complex than it actually seems. For example, a lot of people still believe that plants only absorb ammonium and nitrate from the water column, leaving toxic ammonia and nitrite behind in the tank, but this is not correct. Dianna Walstad has addressed part of this myth directly, even publishing an excerpt from her book on her blog, and I linked it in the description. It explains how certain aquatic plants in fact can use nitrite as their nitrogen source, and this research, and this research are linked in the description back this up. In fact, one of those studies found that all of the plants they tested could use nitrite, while another showed that some plants actually prefer using nitrite as their nitrogen source over nitrate. But it doesn't stop there, as plants primarily prefer ammonium as their nitrogen source, and the ratio of toxic ammonia and non-toxic ammonium in your aquarium can vary drastically based on water temperature and pH. Thankfully, this research linked in the description came up with this handy table to work out your ammonia to ammonium ratio to help gauge what's actually in your tank depending on its pH and water temperature. So while plants do prefer ammonium, this research suggests that at least some plants can use toxic ammonia directly out of the water column if no other nitrogen source is available. So we can presume that at least some aquatic plants can process ammonia, ammonium, nitrite and nitrate, making them very valuable in this type of aquarium. Fun fact, multiple research papers quoted so far found that duckweed was one of the best plants for absorbing both toxic ammonia and toxic nitrite, but unfortunately it can be a bit of a headache to manage in a tank. Now, the specific type and the amount of plants used in your tank will play a significant role in how effective they are for their filtration capacity. I do have videos on my channel going over the best and worst plants for Walstad method aquariums that I link in this video's description. Thankfully, it's not just the plants doing all of the work, so if you do choose some underperforming plants, there's still a backup, and that's where bacteria play a massive role in this type of aquarium. Dianna Walstad dedicates an entire chapter in her book to the different types of bacteria in aquariums. The average Walstad tank has plenty of substrate surface area with access to oxygenated water, providing the perfect environment for beneficial beneficial bacteria colonies. But there is a twist, because we've known about ammonia oxidizing bacteria since the 1890s. Ammonia oxidizing archaea weren't discovered until 2005. Therefore, archaea are still a newer area of research, but they are mentioned in the book briefly. Studies have shown that in some tanks, archaea can be the dominant ammonia processors and bacteria do little to nothing. This research found that ammonia oxidizing archaea were the dominant ammonia processor in 23 of the 27 biofilters they tested, with 12 of them not having any bacteria involvement at all. I would guess that this is due to the relatively narrow range of water parameters where ammonia oxidizing bacteria are effective, whereas archaea potentially have a wider range of suitable parameters letting them do their job and process ammonia into nitrite. So, while plants are an important part of filtration in Walstad Method tanks, the amount and type of plants you use do matter, with faster grown, submerged and floating plants offering the most benefit. But don't underestimate the bacteria and archaea colonies that will form in your tank substrate and other surfaces, and they can handle a surprisingly large share of the ammonia and nitrite processing, working as a team with your plants to keep your tank healthy. The next myth is that Walstad Method tanks don't need water changes, but this isn't entirely accurate. Now, it is possible to set up a tank that rarely, if ever, needs water changes, but Dianna Walstad herself confirms that she usually does a partial water change every 3 to 6 months on an established tank. So, while water changes can be minimized, they're not entirely eliminated with this type of setup. For example, new tanks often require more frequent water changes due to the excess nutrients leaking into the water from the soil. I'm checking the water parameters of my new Walstad tank every day, but it's only a week old right now and the high ammonia levels will be reduced over the coming weeks. But if the ammonia levels do get too high to a level where they can even start to harm plants, I have no problem doing a water change, but so far there hasn't been any need. Additionally, the book explains that tap water can be a vital source of nutrients for plants, but topping off evaporated water regularly can help maintain these nutrient levels. So if your tank is stable and there's no specific reason for a water change, you may be able to skip them. But it is important to monitor water parameters carefully if you choose to go without water changes for an extended period of time. If your water parameter tests do pick up a problem, then do a water change as required, as the safety of your livestock and plants take priority. Now, some people on social media do try to argue that without water changes, TDS or total dissolved solids will constantly build up in a Walstad Method tank and eventually cause issues. But TDS is a very complex metric that measures many different things under the same label, and suitable plants in sufficient amounts can help manage it effectively for a surprisingly long period of time. For example, plants absorb most of the organic compounds and nutrient salts measured in the TDS reading and use them as nutrition to keep them in check. Now, if you are adding liquid fertilizers to your tank, then this can eventually become an issue, but people relying on fish waste and soil nutrients shouldn't have this issue, making it less of a problem for the Walstad method. But some people argue that plants aren't great at absorbing the heavy metals like copper, lead and mercury in the TDS reading. However, a properly set up Walstad method tank shouldn't have any significant sources of these heavy metals in the water column, keeping them at safe levels that your plants can manage. You may also hear that most live plants struggle to use silicates in a TDS reading, and while this is true to some extent, as regular plants generally don't process silicates in large amounts, there are things in there that will. For example, brown diatom algae absolutely thrives on silicates in an aquarium and they can quickly bloom with just a slight increase. Personally, I don't worry about the silicate levels in my tank because I keep shrimp in all of them and snails in a lot of them, and they absolutely love to eat brown diatom algae, so that easily manages the silicate and brown diatom algae levels. However, there is one aspect of TDS that plants and algae won't help with, and that's non-nutrient salts such as those introduced by medications. But medications are typically only added to your tank if you have a sick fish, and ideally you'll be dosing them to a quarantine tank, not your main Walstad method tank, because some medications can actually harm your plants and crash your tank. So while TDS buildup can be a concern for some aquarium setups without water changes, the plants used in a Walstad Method tank should be able to mitigate the problem for a very long period of time. The next myth is that you don't use fertilizers in a Walstad Method tank, but again this isn't entirely true. Personally, I do aim to try and build my Walstad style tanks in a way that don't require fertilizers, but this is a lot more challenging than a lot of people think. For example, Dianna Walstad dedicates a full page in her book to the methods for increasing water hardness and boosting calcium, magnesium and potassium levels that are also essential nutrients for plants. But she also acknowledges that adding a potassium and iron fertilizer can be very beneficial. This is because potassium and bioavailable iron can be particularly tricky to maintain naturally in aquariums. Potassium is also a main nutrient for plants, with it being essential for healthy growth, so it is very important. A few months ago, some of the plants in my Walstad Method shrimp tank did start to show signs of a potassium deficiency. At first I thought the increased bioload from adding some Medaka rice fish to it had resolved the issue, but I have recently realised that it's probably been the mulberry leaves that I've been adding as a shrimp food, as they contain around half the potassium of a banana by weight. So because of this, I have been thinking of more natural ways to try and boost potassium and iron levels in my tanks. My 40-gallon tank currently has potassium deficiency issues, and I recently spoke to my friend's dad, who's been keeping this type of aquarium for decades with minimal issues, but for some reason he never ever seems to have issues with potassium deficiencies in his tank, and when I spoke to him, he is convinced that's due to him adding spinach to his tanks every day to feed his shrimp. Now I have no idea if this is true, but I did do a little research and I found that spinach actually has around 150% of the potassium of a banana by weight, making it one of the best natural sources available. So I'm planning on trying this method in my own tanks, and I've bought a big bag of frozen spinach to use as a food source for my shrimp, scuds, water louse and snails, and I hope it naturally increases potassium levels without relying on commercial fertilizers. According to WebMD, spinach is also high in iron too, so I'm curious how this goes moving forward. But as Dianna says in her book, a potassium and iron fertilizer will probably be a far easier option. The next myth is that the research in Dianna Walstad's book is outdated. As far as I can tell, this comes from Bentley Pascoe, as in one of his videos he mentions that the research is all between 20 and 40 years old. But from what I can tell, Bentley is completely open about preferring aquasoil tanks over dirted tanks. So it's unclear if he's actually tried the Walstad method in an aquarium, and based on the comments he makes in that video, I don't think he's actually read the book either. Yes, the original book was first published back in 1999, but the version that I'm referencing in this video is the 4th edition released in 2023. So it's important to note that the book gets updated with each new edition to include new relevant research. A quick check of the reference pages for each chapter confirms that new studies have been added over time to keep the book aligned with current research and findings. So if you are interested in Walstad Method tanks or planted tanks in general, I highly recommend reading this book, but be sure to get the latest edition so you are working with the most up-to-date information. The next myth is that you can instantly stock a Walstad Method tank, and even Dianna Walstad mentions that she sometimes stocks her tanks the same day she sets them up. But personally, I do think that this is a bad idea, especially for beginners who are setting up their very first planted tank. This is the water parameter check that I did just 12 hours after setting up my new 29-gallon Walstad Method tank. As you can see, the ammonia levels were already at 1 ppm, as the soil I used leached a lot of ammonia into the water column, creating a toxic environment until the tank balances, and this can be very, very common. You might think that the plants would begin processing ammonia instantly, but that's not always true either. Some plants need time to establish themselves in a new tank, and while some plants do adapt quickly, such as floating plants, and get straight to work, others can take a long period of time. For example, the plants I ordered for my new 29-gallon tank all arrived in their emergent out-of-water form, so they need time to convert to their submerged form before they can start to process nitrogen compounds effectively. Some people often use the wrong plants or too few of the right plants in their very first Walstad Method tank to reducing the speed that the nitrogen compounds are processed to keep the water safe. You might also think that the bacteria in archaea colonies would handle this ammonia, but they also need time to multiply and establish themselves up to numbers that can handle the load, which can take weeks. Then you might be thinking that you can go off and buy one of the bacteria in a bottle products to speed everything up, but as I showed earlier on Fritz's own website, who make Fritzzyme 7, probably one of the most reputable products like this in the market, their product only works in a specific water parameter range, with efficiency drastically dropping off the further you get from that. Even if you do get a bacteria in a bottle product and you have the suitable water parameters, it can still take a week or two for these levels to boost up to handle the nitrogen compounds effectively. So if you are new to the hobby, I highly recommend against adding fish to your tank right away unless you're happy to do daily large water changes to balance the nitrogen levels in the tank to keep your fish safe. And if you're setting up a Walstad shrimp tank, waiting a couple of weeks for the nitrogen levels to balance is even more beneficial, as this gives algae and biofilm a chance to grow in the tank, so there's a food source in there for your shrimp. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope it's been helpful and your Walstad tanks are thriving. Thanks for watching and have a good day.